Hello, my name is Michaela Corinne, and welcome back to another episode of the Divine Daughter Project podcast. I'm so sorry that it's been a while since I've posted. Just had a lot of things happen in life between some of the summer holidays and activities and work and getting sick and all that. We finally have some time to film again, and hopefully this will be a more regular thing again to posting every Monday or so. Just some quick updates on how the Divine Daughter Project is coming. I'm going through some sources in the Discourses of Brigham Young by John A. Woodstow, and finishing up with the last volume of the complete Discourses and Poetry of Eliza R. Snow. And so hopefully within the next month-ish, we should be getting some real updates on an actual draft being done. This week we will be back in The Women of Mormondom by Edward W. Tullidge. We're about halfway-ish through right now. And next week we should be having some videos on women in scripture coming out. Okay. We are in chapter 28. 29. We're skipping 28 just because there's not much in there. It's talking about the Queen of England and some poetry on Queen of England. You can go read that yourself. So we'll be starting in chapter 29, where we're following the story of Priscilla Mogridge Staines, who was born in Woodbrick, Wiltshire, England, March 11th, 1823. Okay. So she ends up becoming converted, and this was not popular in England at the time. We're talking about the mid-1800s, so yeah. And so she decided that she was going to be baptized. And she said, "It is proper to here state that baptism was a trial to the converts in England in those days. They had to steal away, even unknown to their friends oftentimes, and scarcely daring to tell the saints themselves that they were about to take up the cross, and not until the ordinance had been administered, and the Holy Ghost gave them boldness, could they bring themselves to proclaim openly that they had cast in their lot with the despised Mormons. Nor was this all, for generally the elders had to administer baptism when the village was wrapped in sleep, lest persecutors should gather a mob to disturb the solemn scene with jibes and curses, accompanied with stones or clods of earth torn from the river bank, and hurled at the disciple and minister during the performance of the ceremony." So just already crazy baptism experience. You have to steal away in the dead of night to get baptized, because otherwise you're going to be faced with a lot of persecution, and like some serious persecution, not just like, "Oh, I hate that you're doing this," mean words persecution, but not just curses, but actual stones being thrown. So kind of put some things in perspective so far as the kind of things we deal with, and it's not as bad as it used to be, because yes, there are still a lot of people who hate all of the religion of Mormondom and the gospel, Book of Mormon prophets, all that. And we just don't typically deal with it the same way. Most of what we get today is mean words and stuff, unless you're living in another country. There are some countries still in the world where they are facing this kind of persecution. And to be faithful through that extremeness is severe dedication. On the evening of a bitterly cold day in midwinter, as before stated, I walked 4 miles to the house of a local elder for baptism. Arriving at his house, we waited until midnight, in order that the neighbors might not disturb us, and then repaired to a stream of water a 1/4 mile away. So, we're now at 4¼ miles she's had to walk in the middle of winter to go be baptized. So, again, dedication. Here we found the water, as we anticipated, frozen over, and the elder had to chop a hole in the ice large enough for the purpose of baptism. It was a scene and occasion I shall never forget. So, she just walked 4.25 miles. And then he has to chop into the ice so she can be baptized in the literally freezing cold water. Memory today brings back the emotions and sweet awe of that moment. None but God and his angels and the few witnesses who stood on the bank with us heard my covenant. But in the solemnity of that midnight hour, it seemed as though all nature were listening, and the recording angel writing our words in the book of the Lord. Is it strange that such a scene occurring in the life of a Latter-day Saint should make an everlasting impression as this did on mine? Having been thus baptized, I returned to the house in my wet and freezing garments. This is one of the great things about the Spirit and doing something because you know it's true, is even in the hardship, in the walking 4.25 miles in the dead of winter, in the dead of night, chopping a hole into ice to be baptized in literally freezing cold water, and then walking back 4.25 miles in those freezing wet clothes that are turning into ice, that it is still beautiful and peaceful and impressing upon the mind. And that's probably the beauty that God gives us, those kind of tender mercies and graces that he gives us, especially when we're doing what he wants us to do. Okay. Shortly thereafter, December 27th, 1843, I left the home of my birth to gather to Nauvoo. I was alone. It was a dreary winter day on which I went to Liverpool. The company with which I was to sail were all strangers to me. When I arrived at Liverpool and saw the ocean that would soon roll between me and all I loved, my heart almost failed me. But I had laid up my idols all upon the altar. There was no turning back. I remembered the words of my Saviour, "He that leaveth not father and mother, brother and sister, for my sake, is not worthy of me." And I believed his promise to those who forsook all for his sake. So I thus alone set out for the reward of everlasting life, trusting in God. And that's the thing, is the law of sacrifice is real. We're going to have to put things on the altar. We're going to have to make hard choices sometimes to follow God and do what he wants us to do. Life is not all sunshine, roses, lollipops, and rainbows. There is hardship and there is sacrifice, and what it ultimately comes down to is, are you doing what God asked you to do to the best of your ability? So she's on her way over. She gets there in New Orleans after 6 weeks. And then they're supposed to get on the steamer called the Maid of Iowa. The steamer Maid of Iowa, belonging to the Prophet Joseph, and on which the Company of Saints had expected to ascend the Mississippi to Nauvoo, was embargoed and lashed to the wharf. But Providence came to our aid. A lady of fortune was in the company, a Mrs. Bennet, and out of her private purse she not only lifted the embargo, but also fitted out the steamer with all necessary provisions, fuel, etc. And soon the company were again on their way. So finally got to America and immediately faced with hardship with this boat. But it's not the first hardship that they're going to face with this boat. And so about 5 weeks it takes them to get from New Orleans to Nauvoo. And this is what happens next. So they have to stop at Memphis. At Memphis, some villain placed a half-consumed cigar under a straw mattress and other bedding that had been laid out after the ladies' cabin to air. When we steamed out into the river, the draft created by the motion of the boat soon fanned the fire into a quick flame. Fortunately, I myself discovered the fire and gave the alarm in time to have it extinguished before it consumed more than a portion of the adjoining woodwork. Perhaps 1 minute more of delay in its discovery, and that company of 250 souls would have been subjected to all the horrors and perils incident to a panic and fire on shipboard. So then they face another problem with a storm coming in. So they came to a port and tried to dock overnight. But a mob gathered because it's the Mormon boat. And so they start trying to think, okay, what are we going to do to this Mormon boat? And it says, thus doubtless would have thought the mob who gathered at that landing place and cut the boat adrift, the Maid of Iowa was now submitted to the triple peril of being adrift without steam, at the mercy of a treacherous current, and in the midst of a hurricane. The captain, however, succeeded in raising the steam, and the boat was brought under sufficient control to enable her to be brought to under shelter of a heavy forest, where she was tied up to the trees and weathered the gale. So they're able to get it under control. At another landing, a mob collected and began throwing stones through the cabin windows, smashing the glass and sash and jeopardizing the lives of the passengers. This was a little too much for human forbearance. The boat was in command of the famous Mormon captain Dan Jones. His Welsh blood was now thoroughly warm. He knew what mobs meant. Mustering the brethren with determined wrath, he ordered them to parade with loaded muskets on the side of the boat assailed. Then he informed the mob that if they did not instantly desist, he would shoot them down like so many dogs. And like so many dogs, they slunk away. So, in their journey, they have the ship embargoed, and they're blessed with a woman who is able to pay the embargo and all the provisions and fuel and everything they need for the boat. And then they find themselves in the midst of a storm. They're able to dock, and they're sent off by a mob into what she describes as a hurricane. Whether or not it was an actual hurricane, the way we talk about them today, my guess would be probably not, because we're on the Mississippi. But it was probably some sort of, like, severe storm, maybe a tropical storm, maybe. I don't know. But serious storm that could potentially sink the boat. And they're again blessed by being able to get it to a forest that they can tie it to. And then they have to face another mob who's trying to throw rocks and stuff onto the boat. And this time the captain saves them. And I think this just goes to show that life is full of hardship, but God will send little blessings and mercies along the way. As the Maid of Iowa had made slow progress and had been frequently passed by more swift-going steamers, her progress was well known by the friends of Nauvoo, so on the day of our arrival the saints were out en masse to welcome us. I had never before seen any of those assembled, yet I felt certain, as the boat drew nearer, that I should be able to pick out the prophet Joseph at first sight. This belief I communicated to Mrs. Bennet, whose acquaintance I had made on the voyage. She wondered at it, but I felt impressed by the spirit that I should know him. As we neared the pier, the prophet was standing among the crowd. At the moment, however, I recognized him according to the impression, and pointed him out to Miss Bennet, with whom I was standing alone on the hurricane deck. Scarcely had the boat touched the pier when, singularly enough, Joseph sprang on board, and, without speaking with anyone, made his way direct to where we were standing, and addressing Mrs. Bennet by name, thanked her kindly for lifting the embargo from his boat, and blessed her for so materially aiding the saints. I think this shows a few things of just this gift that this woman was given, that Priscilla was given, in she'd sacrificed so much, and so she got to be blessed with, you'll know the prophet when you see him. And then also just goes to show some of Joseph's character of coming to meet the saints and to thank Ms. Bennet personally for what she had done for that ship. And there's lots of stories like that of Joseph going and meeting the immigrants, coming personally, and things like that. Okay, continuing on, we have talk of polygamy happening, because you have, so since we're kind of in that Nauvoo era, they're like, we can't leave this without talking about polygamy, because there has been a lot of talk since Joseph has died that it was just something made up by Brigham Young and John Taylor and some other people, and that Joseph never practiced it. So this is coming from the Saints. This was, again, published 1877. And this is what they say. Polygamy was undoubtedly introduced by Joseph himself at Nauvoo between 1840 and 1844. Years afterwards, however, a monogamic rival church under the leadership of young Joseph Smith, so Joseph Smith III, the firstborn of the prophet, arose, denying that the founder of Mormondom was the author of polygamy and affirming that its origin was in Brigham Young, subsequent to the martyrdom of the prophet and his brother Hiram. Okay, so this is where the beginning of all the Joseph Smith never taught polygamy, and it's all Brigham Young and all that. That's where that comes from. It comes from Joseph Smith III not wanting to believe it, and some claims made by Emma because she had some issues with it, which is a whole nother story, and I do not judge Emma in any way, shape, or form, to be clear. There was a lot of hardship in her life. And that's another story for another day. But this is them saying, no, Joseph Smith taught it, and here's some people to talk about it. The great historic period of the women of Mormondom is during the exodus of the church and its removal to the Rocky Mountains, when they figured quite as strongly as did the women of ancient Israel in the exodus to Egypt. So they're like, okay, we see most of the great stories of the women of Mormondom once we start doing the exodus over to Utah. However, we need to address this in Nauvoo. And so here we have Eliezer Snow touching the city of the saints, and then slightly on the introduction of polygamy. She says, okay, to narrate what transpired within 7 years in which we built and occupied Nauvoo, the beautiful, would fill many volumes. That is a history that never will and never can repeat itself. This was also the city in which the Relief Society was started. That happened in Nauvoo. So there's a lot that happened in Nauvoo. Some of the most important events of my life transpired within that brief term, in which I was married, and in which my husband, Joseph Smith, the prophet of God, sealed his testimony with his blood. Although in my youth I had considered marriage to have been ordained of God, I had remained single, and today I acknowledge the kind overruling providences of God in that circumstance as fully as in any other of my life, for I have not known of one of my former suitors having received the truth, by which it is manifest that I was singularly preserved from the bondage of a marriage tie which would, in all probability, have prevented my receiving or enjoying the free exercise of that religion which has been and is now dearer to me than life. In Nauvoo, I had the first intimation, or at least the first understanding, that the practice of a plurality of wives would be introduced into the church. The thought was very repugnant to my feelings, and in direct opposition to my educational prepossessions. But when I reflected that this was the dispensation of the fullness of times, embracing all other dispensations, it was plain that plural marriage must be included, and I consoled myself with the idea that it was a long way in the distance, beyond the period of my mortal existence, and that, of course, I should not have it to meet. However, it was announced to me that the set time had come, that God had commanded his servants to establish the order by taking additional wives. I was sealed to the prophet Joseph Smith for time and eternity, in accordance with the celestial law of marriage which God had revealed, the ceremony being performed by a servant of the Most High, authorized to officiate in sacred ordinances. This, one of the most important events of my life, I have never had cause to regret. The more I comprehend the pure and ennobling principle of plural marriage, the more I appreciate it. It is a necessity in the salvation of the human family, a necessity in redeeming woman from the curse, and the world from its corruptions. When I entered into it, my knowledge of what it was designed to accomplish was very limited. Had I then understood what I now understand, I think I should have hailed its introduction with joy, in consideration of the great good to be accomplished. As it was, I received it because I knew that God required it. Okay, so you have her testimony of this. There's testimonies given, and you can find this in older documents and stuff. There's testimonies given of all the women that Joseph married, and them saying, yes, I was married to him, this was when the sealing happened, this is who performed it, witnesses, all that. There's information like that out there. So it did happen, whether you like it or not. And you cannot like it, that's fine. But it did happen. And I do find this interesting is this, when she said, the thought was very repugnant to my feelings and in direct opposition to my educational prepositions. Because I think we all grow up with certain traditions and are taught things. So, like, for example, for a long time, many, many, many centuries ago, it was taught that the earth was the center of the universe. And when it was put forth that no, the sun is the center of the solar system. The sun is the center of the solar system, not earth. It caused a lot of grief. And if I remember correctly, I think there were people excommunicated from the main church at the time, from the Catholic Church at the time, for declaring such a thing of, like, how preposterous. Because we have these certain traditions that we hold on to when we just, we're like, oh, we love this so much. And it makes it really hard to accept things. And so I think it's very important to look at what is tradition and what is doctrine. And then those things are different from each other. And I believe that plural marriage is a doctrine of the church. And different people have different perspectives and different ideas on what that means and how that looks and how that's entailed. And there's people who disagree with me, and it's like, no, it was a tradition. It was something Abraham did that he shouldn't have done, and he was wrong in doing that. It was something that Joseph of Egypt did, and he was wrong in doing it. Then Joseph Smith was wrong in doing it. And everyone's entitled to their opinion, and that's fine, and you can believe what you want to believe. But for me, and obviously for Eliza Snow here, I do believe that it is doctrine, and that it is beautiful, and that if we understood more about it, then I think people would be less weirded out by it. Because I think we typically have this idea with plural marriage that it's so that men can have a lot of sexual gratification from it, and it's subjecting the women and oppressing the women, and that women kind of become these faceless harem behind the men. And can that happen? Yes. There's people who pervert true things all the time and do evil stuff with them and use it to oppress others. So yes, that can happen, but when practiced correctly, I don't think that's what happens. And I think that it is very ennobling of men and women. It requires them to stand up and take some more responsibility for some things, and to be able to, and it forces people to put some more carnal feelings aside, like jealousy and selfishness. There's some of those things that have to be put aside, and it requires them to take up more responsibility and accountability, and that there's more work that they have to do because of it when it is practiced correctly. And it also, it helps women too, because I'm of the opinion that women, all people are social creatures. Humans generally are social creatures. I believe that is a little more true in some ways of women. That women really need their female friends that they can be around and they can rely upon. And I think that there can be, when practiced correctly and in the way that God wants it to be practiced, that there can be a greater sisterhood there between sister wives. And that also it makes it so women don't have to settle for lesser men. And it can encourage other men who want to be married to actually step it up and to be better. So, are there problems that can come from it? Absolutely. There's problems that can come from anything. When practiced correctly, I think that it can be a wonderful thing. But when practiced incorrectly, it can be a very damaging thing too. So, just some thoughts on that. So, continuing on, she talks about how the Female Relief Society is put together in March of 1842. And then there's some things that happen, and then you have the awful tragedy of the 27th of June, 1844, is a livid, burning, scathing stain on our national escutcheon. Escutcheon. I don't know how you say that word. To look upon the noble, lifeless forms of those brothers, Joseph and Hiram Smith, as they lay side by side in their burial clothes, having been brought home from Carthage, where they had been slaughtered in their manhood and in their innocence, was a sight that might well appall the heart of a true American citizen. But what it was for loving wives and children, the heart may feel, but the tongue can never tell. I think there's a beautiful way of putting that, of the martyrdom of Joseph and Hiram was a serious stain on the nation, of having allowed these two men to be killed when they didn't do anything worthy of being killed for. So, then you have their mother, Mary, come to, is Mary right? Sorry, not Mary, Lucy. Sorry, I was mixing her up with Mary Fielding Smith for a second. You have Lucy give some thoughts on this when she hears about it and sees him and everything. And she said, I sank back, crying to the Lord in the agony of my soul, my God, why hast thou forsaken this family? A voice replied, I have taken them to myself, that they may have rest. Emma was carried back to her room almost in a state of insensibility. Her oldest son approached the corpse and dropped upon his knees, and laying his cheek against his father's, and kissing him, exclaimed, Oh, my father, my father! As for myself, I was swallowed up in the depth of my afflictions, and though my soul was filled with horror past imagination, yet I was dumb, until I arose again to contemplate the spectacle before me. Oh, at that moment, how my mind flew through every scene of sorrow and distress which we had passed together, in which they had shown the innocence and sympathy which filled their guileless hearts. As I looked upon their peaceful, smiling countenances, I seemed almost to hear them say, Mother, weep not for us. We have overcome the world by love. We carried to them the gospel, that their souls might be saved. They slew us for our testimony, and thus placed us beyond their power. Their ascendancy is for a moment. Ours is an eternal triumph. And that's a very harrowing and beautiful reflection, and the comfort that she was given of a voice replying, I have taken them to myself that they may have rest in the midst of her grief. And it doesn't make the grief disappear, but it does bring some comfort of it's okay. We did what we came here to do. We're being taken care of now on the other side. Just kind of don't worry. And Lucy seriously suffered some hardships. And then she continues on to say, I left the scene and returned to my room to ponder upon the calamities of my family. Soon after this, Samuel, one of her other sons, said, "Mother, I have had a dreadful distress in my side ever since I was chased by the mob, and I think I have received some injury which is going to make me sick." And indeed, he was then not able to sit up, as he had been broken of his rest, besides being dreadfully fatigued in the chase, which, joined to the shock occasioned by the death of his brothers, brought on a disease that was never removed. So then they have a funeral for Joseph and Hiram. And then it says, "In a short time, Samuel, who continued unwell, was confined to his bed, and lingering till the 30th of July, his spirit forsook its earthly tabernacle, and went to join his brothers, the ancient martyrs, in the paradise of God." So you have Joseph and Hiram die on the 27th of June, and about a month, just over a month later, you have Samuel die. So that summer, Lucy lost 3 of her sons. I can't imagine how difficult that had to have been for her. And there's people, even today, and I really hope to think that they're few and far between. I don't know if that's true or not, but I really hope that there's not very many of these type of people. But there were people then, and there's still people today who rejoice over something like that, and rejoice over the death of the prophet Joseph still. And that is just such a horrible thing to do. Even, like, let's say for a minute that you don't believe Joseph Smith was a prophet, and you believe that he did a lot of things wrong. Let's say he was completely wrong for instituting polygamy. He's a complete fraud for the Book of Mormon. I don't think any of that's true, but let's say for a second that you do. To rejoice over the death of somebody who leaves behind a weeping widow and a young son, and a mother losing 3 sons in the course of just over a month. That is so horrible. The apathy towards life you have to have for that is just so horrible and so horrific. And unfortunately, we still see that kind of thing today with the death of people, with people joking about how certain people should die, or when people do die, rejoicing over it. And I don't think you necessarily have to cry at the death of everyone. Like, if you didn't know someone very well and you don't cry at their death, that's fine, because you didn't know them very well. But going like, like, this doesn't bring me up, I didn't know that person very much, is very, very different than laughing at their death or rejoicing over their death. And to do something like that is very, very concerning of your soul. Anyway, I was going to end it there, but that was really depressing. So we're going to read one more chapter. This is in the next chapter. So they had to leave for more mobs, because the poor early saints couldn't catch a break. And so they're saved, and they're camping in Sugar Creek. And it says, "Thus, in the song and the dance, the saints praised the Lord. When the night was fine, and supper, which consisted of the most primitive fare, was over, some of the men would clear away the snow, while others bore large logs to the campfires in anticipation of the jubilee of the evening. Soon in a sheltered place the blazing fires would roar, and 50 couples, old and young, would join in the merriest spirit to the music of the band or the rival revelry of the solitary fiddle. As they journeyed along, too, strangers constantly visited their camps, and great was their wonderment to see the order, unity, and good feeling that prevailed in the midst of the people. By the campfires they would linger, listening to the music and song, and they fain had taken part in the merriment had not those scenes been as sacred worship in the exodus of a God-fearing people. To fully understand the incidents here narrated, the reader must couple in his mind the idea of an exodus with the idea of an Israelitish jubilee. For it was a jubilee to the Mormons to be delivered from their enemies at any price. At one point on their journey, the citizens of a town nearby came over to camp to invite the Nauvoo band, under Captain Pitt, to come to their village for a concert. There was some music left in the brethren. They had not forgotten how to sing the songs of Zion, so they made the good folks of the village merry, and for a time forgot their own sorrows. So, even amidst all their struggles and pains and sufferings and persecutions and literally running for their lives, they are able to rejoice and praise God and be thankful, because at least they were still alive, and at least they were still able to worship God, and the news of the gospel is just so good that you're not abandoned forever, you're not going to burn forever, that you'll see your family again, and that everyone can be saved if they so choose. And if they could be so grateful under such horrific circumstances, it kind of makes me think I should be more grateful than I am. Because sometimes I struggle to be grateful, and it can be easy to complain sometimes. And hearing things like this of they rejoice and they dance and they sing because at least they're still alive and still together. Or even not necessarily still together. I'm sure there's some who were separated from family, or some of their family died, and they're still rejoicing because at least they're still alive. At least they're not dealing with the mobs right now in this moment. And it just makes me think that I should be so much more grateful than I am. So, we'll leave it on that note today of no matter what you're going through, no matter how hard it is, you can still be grateful. And that doesn't mean that, like, your life's suddenly not hard. Life is hard, and it's a struggle, and it can be painful. But no matter what, we can still be grateful for what God gives us and what God does for us. But yeah, so that was chapters. Where did we start today? Chapters 29 through 31 today. So, again, as always, there's a lot more in these chapters that you can go read, and I recommend you go read because it is a really good book. And it has a lot of very faith-promoting stories, especially for women who feel like that they're kind of out of place in the gospel, or they're not really sure what the gospel is to them. It's a really good book. Again, The Women of Mormondom by Edward W. Toolidge. This one is just a copy. You can get it off Amazon. It's just all I put into one. So it's going to have different page numbers than if you're reading from an original copy. And maybe the next video I'll try to show an original copy of what that looks like, because the page numbers are very different between the two. In this one, it is, 260 pages long. We're on page 150. So, about 110 pages to go. in the copy we're working from. But anyway, I hope you have a wonderful day and a wonderful week. And hopefully I will see you all next week. Bye.